At 68 years old, I believed I understood the man I had been married to for nearly 3 decades. I was wrong. The private investigator sat across from me at my kitchen table in Boone, Colorado, carefully placing a thick manila folder between us. His hands were steady. Mine were not. Inside that folder was a document I never expected to see. A marriage license. Dated 1999. My husband's signature was there, clear as day. And beside it, another woman's name. The investigator looked at me and said quietly, "Ma'am, you're about to learn something that changes everything." What I was facing wasn't just infidelity, it was something far worse. Bigamy. And under state law, that meant every asset he controlled, every property, every account, every business deal, was no longer what I thought it was. My name is Eleanor Hayes. And this is the story of how one decision, one moment of intuition, saved me from spending the rest of my life living inside a carefully constructed lie. Before I go any further, I need to say this. If you're watching this and something in your own life feels off, you're not imagining it. There is a difference between paranoia and perception. Let me take you back to where everything began. It was early April 2023. Spring was just starting to reach the foothills, and I was sitting alone in our sunroom with a cup of coffee when a realization hit me so suddenly it made my stomach drop. I couldn't remember the last time my husband, Richard, had looked me in the eyes and said, "I love you." When you've lived nearly 70 years, you learn patterns. You learn that when a man who used to come home at 6 p.m. suddenly has client dinners 3 nights a week, something isn't right. When someone who never cared about his phone starts sleeping with it under his pillow, something isn't right. When a man who has been predictable for decades becomes secretive overnight, something is very, very wrong. My daughter, Lauren, thought I was worrying too much. "Mom, Dad's just stressed about retirement," she told me over the phone. "You're almost 70. Maybe you're reading into things. But here's what experience teaches you. Women aren't paranoid. We're perceptive." Richard was a commercial property consultant. Charming. Successful. The kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel comfortable. From the outside, we looked like a stable, well-off couple preparing for a peaceful retirement, but small things began adding up. The way he closed his laptop when I entered the room, the unexplained withdrawals from our joint account. The weekend property inspections that lasted far longer than they ever used to. I wasn't suspicious by nature. But I wasn't foolish either. So on a quiet Tuesday morning, I did something I never imagined I would do. I looked up a private investigator. I didn't tell Richard what I was doing. Not because I felt guilty, but because I didn't want to give him the chance to rewrite the truth before I saw it clearly. The investigator, Mark Delaney, explained the process carefully. Background checks. Public records. Travel history. Property filings. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. "Give me a week," he said. "If there's nothing there, you'll have peace of mind." Peace of mind. I hadn't realized how much I needed that until he said it. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. Richard moved through the house like a polite guest. He kissed my cheek before leaving, asked if I needed anything from the store, commented on the weather. On the surface, everything looked normal. But I noticed how often he left town. 2 days in Raleigh, he said once. A client meeting in Asheville, another time. He never mentioned names. Never shared details. And every time he returned, he seemed lighter, like someone who had just stepped out of a different life and slipped back into mine. On the 4th day, Mark called. "I found something," he said. "It may be nothing, but I want you to be prepared." My stomach tightened. He told me Richard owned property I didn't know about. A small house registered under an LLC I had never heard of. The address was in Wilmington, nearly 4 hours away. Richard had told me he hated the coast. He also told me the property was purchased years ago, well before any of Richard's recent work travel. The deed didn't list my name. That night, I asked Richard casually if he'd ever worked in Wilmington. He didn't hesitate. No, he said. Why? The lie came too easily. The next day, Mark called again. This time, his tone was different. I ran a marital records search in 3 counties, he said. One of them came back, unusual. He explained that Richard's name appeared on a marriage license filed more than 20 years ago, in a different state. Not ours. I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. That can't be right, I said. We've been married since 1995. I know, Mark replied. That's why I kept digging. He asked if Richard had ever mentioned living elsewhere for work in the late 90s. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. A year Richard claimed he was consulting out of state. A year I stayed behind, working and raising our daughter, trusting his explanations without question. Back then, long-distance calls were expensive. Texting didn't exist. It was easy to disappear. Too easy. By the time I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. Nothing had been confirmed yet. But the picture was forming. And I knew, deep down, that whatever Mark was about to uncover next would change the rest of my life. Mark asked if we could meet in person. That alone told me this wasn't going to be a small update. He sat in his office the following afternoon. No coffee. No small talk. Just the sound of papers sliding across the desk toward me. Photographs. Not dramatic ones. Not staged. Just ordinary moments that made my chest tighten. Richard walking into a grocery store with a woman I didn't recognize, Richard holding the hand of a teenage boy outside a school. Richard unloading bags from his car in front of a modest coastal house. A family. Not a fling. Not a mistake. A life. Mark spoke slowly, carefully. The woman's name is Diane Miller, he said. They've been married since 1999. I felt the room tilt. Married. That meant when Richard and I were celebrating anniversaries, sending holiday cards, planning for retirement, he was doing the same thing somewhere else. At least 2 children, Mark continued. One is already in college. The other still lives at home. I pressed my hands flat against my knees to steady myself. How? I asked. How did he afford all of this? Mark hesitated before answering. That's the part you need to understand, he said. Your husband isn't just hiding a family. He opened another folder. He's been moving money for years. Properties, accounts, shell companies. On paper, very little is in his name. He looked directly at me. But you, Eleanor, you're the one listed as the primary beneficiary on most of it. I stared at him, confused. I don't feel rich, I said quietly. He gave a small, humorless smile. That's because you weren't meant to, he replied. But legally speaking, you are. The words didn't bring relief. They brought rage every time I'd clipped coupons. Every time I'd put off a trip. Every time I'd told myself we couldn't afford it. Richard had been funding another household. Another wife. Another set of children. I thought of the nights I'd eaten dinner alone while he claimed to be out of town. The holidays he'd missed because of work. The money that vanished without explanation. It wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. Mark leaned forward. There's more, he said. But before we continue, you need to decide something. He paused. Do you want to confront him, or do you want to protect yourself first? I didn't answer right away. Because for the first time, I understood that this wasn't just about what Richard had done. It was about what I was about to do next, and once I chose, there would be no going back. I didn't confront Richard. Not yet. Every instinct in me wanted to demand answers, to watch his face crack, to hear him stumble over excuses. But Mark's words echoed in my mind. Protect yourself first. So I learned how to stay quiet. I smiled when Richard talked about work. I nodded when he mentioned another upcoming trip. I cooked dinner. I folded laundry. I played the part I'd perfected over decades. But inside, I was documenting everything. Mark connected me with a financial attorney, Laura Chen, who specialized in complex marital assets. She spoke in calm, measured sentences, but what she explained made my heart race. Right now, she said, you have the advantage. He believes you know nothing. We reviewed records late into the evening. Bank statements. Property deeds. Corporate filings. Accounts that had been open longer than my marriage. So all of this, I asked, pointing to the screen, it's real? Laura nodded. Yes. And most of it can be traced back to funds earned during your marriage. Which meant something important. It wasn't just his. It was ours. Richard had spent years telling me we needed to be careful with money. That retirement required sacrifice. That now wasn't the time. All the while, he'd been funding 2 lives, and trusting I'd never look closely enough to notice. The next step was painful but necessary. I opened a separate account in my own name. The first time I saw the balance transfer, I had to sit down. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I'd ever been allowed to touch. Laura placed a hand over mine. You're not stealing, she said gently. You're securing what was already yours. That night, Richard came home later than usual. He smelled like salt and cologne I didn't recognize. Long drive, he said. I'm exhausted. I watched him carefully. He didn't notice the stack of folders in my office drawer. He didn't notice the new password on the computer. He didn't notice that I'd stopped asking questions. And that was the most dangerous part. Because while Richard thought he was living 2 lives without consequence, I was preparing to end both of them. I didn't raise my voice when I finally confronted Richard. I didn't need to. The evidence was louder than anything I could have said. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. He was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels, complaining about nothing in particular. I placed a folder on the coffee table between us. He glanced at it, uninterested. What's that? He asked. Something you forgot to tell me about, I replied. He opened the folder slowly. The first document was a property deed. The second was a bank transfer record. The third, a marriage certificate. He stopped breathing for a moment. I watched his face change, layer by layer. Confusion. Calculation. Then anger. Where did you get this? He demanded. I paid someone to find the truth, I said. Because you never would have told me. He laughed sharply, trying to regain control. This is old history, he said. You're blowing it out of proportion. Old history? I asked. You're still married to her. Silence. That was the moment everything shifted. He leaned back, rubbing his forehead, as if the problem wasn't what he'd done, but that I had discovered it. You don't understand, he said finally. It was complicated. No, I replied. It was deliberate. I told him what I knew. About the house on the coast. About the children. About the money that had been quietly rerouted for years. With each sentence, his posture collapsed further. When I finished, I slid one last document toward him. A notice from my attorney. I'm filing for divorce, I said. And because you were legally married to 2 women at the same time, this doesn't end the way you think it does. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard looked afraid. You wouldn't do that, he said. After everything we've built? I met his eyes. You built lies, I said. I protected them. That night, he packed a bag. Not because I asked him to. But because he finally understood that the silence he'd relied on no longer belonged to him. And while he drove away, I sat alone in the house, realizing something quietly powerful. I wasn't losing a husband, I was getting my life back. The legal process took months. Long meetings. Paperwork. Quiet phone calls that changed everything without drama. Richard tried to delay things at first, arguing technicalities, claiming misunderstandings, but the facts didn't bend for him the way people once had. Bigamy isn't complicated in the eyes of the law. By the time the case concluded, the picture was clear. The second marriage was declared invalid. The hidden assets were uncovered. And the money he had worked so hard to keep out of my sight was finally accounted for. When my attorney sat across from me and reviewed the final numbers, she paused. "You know," she said gently, "you're financially secure. More than you realized." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Not because I was overwhelmed by relief, but because I was overwhelmed by grief. All those years I had lived carefully. All the times I had convinced myself we couldn't afford joy, all the moments I made myself smaller for the sake of stability. None of it had been necessary. Richard didn't fight at the end. There was nothing left to defend. The man who had balanced two lives for decades simply disappeared from mine, reduced to signatures and court orders, stayed in the house for a while after everything was finalized. Then I sold it. I moved somewhere quieter. Smaller. Peaceful. For the first time in years, my days belonged to me. I traveled when I wanted. I rested when I needed to. I spent money without fear or permission. And slowly, something unexpected happened. I stopped replaying the past. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about money, and it isn't even about betrayal, at least, not only that. It's about what happens when a woman finally listens to the voice she's been taught to ignore. If you're watching this and something in your life feels wrong, if you keep telling yourself you're imagining it, or that it's too late to start over, please hear this: clarity has no age limit. Dignity doesn't expire. And the life you think is behind you may still be waiting, quietly, for you to claim it. That's what I did. And it changed everything.